In the 1980s, one man didn't just sell a product, he ignited an epidemic. And when the smoke cleared, America realized the monster wasn't just him, it was the system that built him. In the crumbling heart of South Central Los Angeles, 1960, a child was born into a world already on fire. Ricky Donald Ross entered life in a neighborhood where hope died young and survival was the only currency that mattered. His mother cleaned houses for white families in the hills. His father drifted in and out of their lives like smoke. The schools were overcrowded, the streets were tribal, and the future was a promise nobody believed in anymore. Young Rick couldn't read. The letters on the page twisted and danced, mocking him, sentencing him before he'd even had a chance to defend himself. Dyslexia, they'd call it decades later. But in the 1970s, in South Central, they just called you stupid. His teachers gave up. The system gave up. So Rick gave up too. Not on life, but on playing by rules that were never written for people who looked like him. He watched his neighborhood decay, watched the factories close, watched grown men who'd worked honest jobs their whole lives stand on corners with empty eyes and emptier pockets. The American dream had packed its bags and left South Central without saying goodbye. And in that vacuum, something else moved in. Something darker. Something that didn't care if you could read, only if you could count money. Rick played tennis. Not because he loved the sport, but because it was his ticket out. He was good. Good enough to get a scholarship to college. Good enough to escape. But life in South Central doesn't let go easily. His high school made a mistake on his transcripts. One error, one bureaucratic fumble, and his scholarship evaporated like morning dew under the California sun. The door to his future slammed shut, and the only door left open led straight to the streets. He didn't walk through that door. He kicked it down. 1979. Rick was 19 years old, pumping gas, washing cars, doing anything to survive. He wasn't looking for crime. Crime found him, the way it always finds young men with nowhere else to go. But Rick wasn't like the others. He had something most street hustlers never develop: a mind for business, a genius for logistics, and a hunger that couldn't be satisfied by small-time hustles. Then he met Henry Corrales. Henry wasn't flashy. He didn't wear gold chains or drive expensive cars. He was quiet, calculated, and he saw something in Rick that others missed. He didn't just teach Rick how to sell stuff. He taught him how to think like an empire builder: supply and demand, territory management, customer retention, distribution networks. Henry wasn't a street dealer. He was a professor, and the streets were his classroom. But Henry's real gift to Rick wasn't knowledge. It was an introduction. Enter Danilo Blandon, a Nicaraguan exile with ties that stretched all the way back to a war most Americans didn't understand, and a government conspiracy most would never believe. Blandon had connections to the Contras, the CIA-backed rebels fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And Blandon had something else: access to powder. Pure, cheap, seemingly endless supplies of powder that flowed like water from South America through hidden channels, protected by forces Rick couldn't see and wouldn't understand until it was too late. Blandon didn't just sell to Rick, he made him a partner. And with that partnership, Rick went from being a street hustler to becoming the central nervous system of an operation that would poison an entire generation. The year was 1980. The product was powder. But Rick saw something others didn't. Powder was expensive, and poor people couldn't afford it. But if you cooked it down, added baking soda, heated it just right, you got something else. Something cheaper. Something more addictive. Something that could be sold in small, affordable rocks. They called it crack. And Rick became its king. Rick didn't sell stuff. He sold a system. And the system was beautiful in its brutality. He started small, a few $100s a day, then thousands, then tens of thousands. By 1982, he was moving $50,000 worth of product daily. By 1984, it was $100,000. By 1985, he was processing between $2 and $3 million every single day. Not week, not month, every single day. He wasn't a gangster in the traditional sense. He didn't kill for reputation or territory. He didn't need to. Violence is expensive and attracts attention. Rick's weapon was efficiency. He operated like a Fortune 500 corporation. Only his product destroyed lives instead of enriching them. His distribution network was genius. He didn't sell to users, he sold to dealers, wholesale only. He became the Sam's Club of crack, offering bulk discounts that undercut every competitor. If you wanted to sell in Los Angeles, you bought from Rick, because nobody else could match his prices or his quality. He franchised his operation, turning independent dealers into de facto employees without them even realizing it. He bought cars in bulk and gave them to his dealers as signing bonuses. He provided protection, territory, and product on credit. If you worked for Rick, even if you didn't know you worked for Rick, you had everything you needed to succeed. All you had to do was sell, and sell they did. South Central became a war zone. Compton, Watts, Long Beach, Inglewood. Neighborhoods transformed overnight into open-air markets where 12-year-olds sold death on corners and mothers smoked away their welfare checks. Bodies piled up, not from Rick's guns, but from the addictions he fed. The gang wars over territory, the police raids that treated every black man as a suspect, and every neighborhood as enemy territory. Rick wasn't there for any of it. He was in the shadows, counting money, expanding territory, building an empire that stretched across California and into cities most people couldn't find on a map. Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis. Wherever poverty existed, wherever hope had died, Rick's product found a home. He bought houses, dozens of them, not to live in, but as stash locations, distribution centers, money-counting operations. He employed hundreds of people, though most never met him, never knew his real name. To them, he was just the connect, the invisible hand that kept the supply flowing. His money poured in faster than he could spend it. Millions in cash, stuffed in walls, buried in backyards, hidden in garages. He bought cars like normal people bought groceries, Porsches, Mercedes, BMWs, purchasing them in cash from dealerships that didn't ask questions because money has a way of making people blind. But Rick wasn't flashy. He didn't wear jewelry or throw parties. He lived modestly, moved quietly, and kept his head down. Because Rick understood something fundamental. The moment you become visible, you become vulnerable. And for years, it worked. While other dealers got arrested, got killed, got famous, and then got destroyed, Rick stayed invisible. The police knew something was happening. They saw the epidemic spreading, saw the neighborhoods burning, but they couldn't find the source. Because the source was a ghost, a phantom who existed only in whispers and rumors. Freeway Rick Ross. The man who couldn't read became the man nobody could catch. While Rick built his empire, America burned. Crack didn't just destroy individuals, it annihilated communities. Mothers sold their bodies for $5 rocks. Fathers abandoned their children to chase the next high. Babies were born addicted, shaking and screaming in hospital wards while doctors shook their heads in helpless horror. The violence was medieval. Gangs went to war over street corners, over disrespect, over colors and hand signs and territories that shifted like sand. Drive-by shootings became so common they barely made the news. Children slept in bathtubs to avoid stray bullets. Entire blocks became ghost towns as those who could afford to leave fled, leaving behind only those too poor or too broken to escape. The Bloods and the Crips, once rival gangs with territorial disputes, became armies, their wars fueled by crack money. Young men who should have been in college were instead in coffins or prisons. The crack trade didn't create the gangs, but it gave them weapons, money, and a reason to kill each other with industrial efficiency. And the government? The government watched. Worse than watched. It participated. Because while Rick was building his empire with powder from Blandon was using that money to fund the Contras. The same government that would later declare a war on drugs was, at that exact moment, facilitating the flow of powder into American cities to fund a proxy war in Central America. The CIA didn't pull the trigger, but they loaded the gun, handed it to Rick, and pointed him at his own community. This wasn't conspiracy theory. Years later, investigations would reveal the connections. The flights from Colombia to Nicaragua, the protection provided to traffickers, the willful blindness of authorities who knew what was happening, but looked the other way, because the powder money was funding freedom fighters. Rick didn't know any of this. He thought he was just a businessman, just a kid from South Central who'd figured out how to win in a game rigged against him. He didn't see the puppeteers pulling his strings. He didn't realize he was a weapon, aimed at his own people by forces that saw black communities as acceptable collateral damage in a geopolitical chess game. By 1986, crack had spread beyond California. It was in New York, Chicago, Miami, Houston, Philadelphia. Every major city with a black community saw the same pattern: an explosion of addiction, violence, and despair. Prisons filled beyond capacity. Mandatory minimum sentences were passed, targeting crack users with penalties 100 times harsher than those for powder, even though they were chemically almost identical. Poor people went to prison for decades. Rich people who used powder got rehab and second chances. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. And at the center of it all, still invisible, still counting money, still expanding his empire, was Rick Ross. The man who couldn't read was writing the darkest chapter in American drug history. By the mid-1980s, Rick wasn't just rich. He was wealthy beyond comprehension. Conservative estimates put his operation at over $3 million per day. Some say it was more, much more. He owned apartment buildings, legitimate businesses, car lots. He laundered money through real estate, purchasing properties through shell companies and fronts. He employed lawyers, accountants, and legitimate business people who managed his legal enterprises while his illegal empire continued to expand. But Rick was still a kid from South Central. He bought his mother a house, a real house, in a good neighborhood, far from the chaos he'd created. He helped his family, his friends, anyone from the old neighborhood who needed money. He wasn't trying to be a hero, but in a community abandoned by everyone else, money talks, and Rick's money spoke loudly. He played tennis still, at country clubs where members didn't know the quiet black man on court. 3 was the biggest crack dealer in American history. He lived in nice neighborhoods, drove expensive cars, wore regular clothes. If you passed him on the street, you'd never suspect. He looked like a successful businessman, which, in a twisted way, he was. His operation employed thousands, directly and indirectly. Dealers, runners, stash house managers, drivers, lookouts, enforcers. He created an entire shadow economy in neighborhoods where legitimate jobs had long since disappeared. Was it blood money? Absolutely. But for people with no other options, Rick's organization was the only thing standing between them and starvation. This is the complicated truth about Rick Ross. He was simultaneously the disease and the symptom. He poisoned his community, yes. But his community had already been poisoned by poverty, racism, economic abandonment, and institutional neglect. Rick didn't create the desperation. He just monetized it. His partners trusted him because he kept his word. His dealers respected him because he treated them fairly. In a business built on betrayal, Rick's reputation was his greatest asset. If he said he'd provide product, he provided it. If he said he'd protect you, he protected you. In a world of snakes, Rick was a shark. Predatory, yes, but at least predictable. But empires built on sand eventually sink. And by 1986, the tide was coming in. The police had been chasing Rick for years. But chasing smoke is hard when you don't know where to look. He operated through intermediaries, never touched product himself, never kept records. His money was laundered through legitimate businesses. His identity was protected by layers of insulation. But in 1986, 2 things happened that changed everything. First, the federal government passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, creating mandatory minimum sentences specifically targeting crack. Possession of 5 grams of crack got you 5 years, the same sentence as possession of 500 grams of powder. The disparity was obvious, racist, and intentional. But it gave federal agents new tools to flip low-level dealers into informants. Second, Rick's supplier, Danilo Blandon, got caught. And when Blandon got caught, he did what survivors do. He talked. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, carefully, trading information for leniency. And the biggest piece of information he had was a name: Freeway Rick Ross. The DEA, the FBI, the LAPD, the ATF. Suddenly, every alphabet agency and law enforcement was looking for the same man. The ghost finally had a face. The phantom finally had a name. But Rick didn't know. He was still operating, still moving product, still building his empire. He'd survived this long by being careful, by being smart, by trusting no one. But the problem with being at the top is that everyone beneath you becomes a potential threat. In 1988, Rick was pulled over for a traffic violation. Routine stop. But the officers found a weapon in the car. Not drugs, just a gun. But that was enough. He was arrested, charged with weapons violations, and sentenced to prison. Not for being the biggest crack dealer in American history, for having a gun during a traffic stop. He served 4 years. While he was inside, his empire didn't collapse. It evolved. His lieutenants took over. His distribution networks adapted. His dealers found new suppliers. The machine Rick built was bigger than any one man, even its creator. When he was released in 1992, Rick tried to go straight. He bought a house, started a legitimate business, tried to live the quiet life he'd never had. He'd made his money, served his time, and wanted out. But the streets don't let go. And neither does the government. Rick had been out for 3 years, living clean, running legitimate businesses. Then Oscar Danilo Blandon reappeared. The same man who'd supplied Rick with tons of powder in the 1980s. The same man who'd introduced him to the Nicaraguan connection. The same man who was now working as a DEA informant, paid by the government to set up the very dealers he'd created. Blandon called Rick, said he had an opportunity. One last deal. 50 kilos of powder. Easy money. Enough to set Rick up for life, allow him to truly retire. Rick should have said no. Should have hung up, blocked the number, disappeared. But Blandon was convincing, and Rick, despite everything, still trusted him. It was a setup. Every word, every promise, every detail designed by federal agents to trap the one who got away. When Rick showed up to inspect the product he was only looking at, not purchasing according to him, the government was waiting, arrested. Again. But this time was different. This time, they had him on tape, had witnesses, had evidence. This time, the government threw everything at him. Conspiracy to distribute, continuing criminal enterprise, every charge they could think of. The trial was a spectacle. Prosecutors painted Rick as a monster, the man responsible for poisoning an entire generation. His defense argued entrapment, government conspiracy, racism. Both sides were right. The jury convicted him. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Life. For a non-violent drug offense. For being set up by a government informant who'd supplied him in the first place. Rick Ross, the man who'd built an empire invisible to law enforcement for over a decade, was finally caught. But not through brilliant police work or thorough investigation. Through betrayal, through a setup, through the very system that had enabled his rise in the first place. Inside federal prison, Rick had nothing but time. Time to think. Time to realize the truth about his life. Time to understand that he'd never been as powerful as he thought. He'd been a pawn in a much larger game. He'd never learned to read as a child, but in prison, he finally did. Books became his escape, his education, his redemption. He read about history, about economics, about the CIA's role in Central America. He read about the Iran-Contra affair, about government complicity in drug trafficking. He read, and he realized he'd been a weapon, a tool used by forces he never saw and wouldn't have understood even if he had seen them. The powder that made him rich came from cartels protected by government agencies. The money from his sales-funded guerrilla armies. The epidemic he helped create was allowed, encouraged even, because it served geopolitical interests more important than black lives in South Central. Rick wasn't innocent. He made choices, sold poison, built an empire on suffering. But he was also a symptom of a much larger disease: systemic racism, economic abandonment, government corruption, and the willingness to sacrifice communities of color on the altar of political expediency. He filed appeals, he wrote letters, he gave interviews to journalists, including the groundbreaking reporting by Gary Webb that exposed the CIA Contra crack connection. Webb's reporting was initially dismissed, then vindicated, then forgotten as Webb himself was destroyed by the establishment he'd exposed. Rick watched from prison as his story became mythology, as a rapper took his name and built a career on it, as the legend of Freeway Rick Ross grew larger and more distorted with each retelling. Inside those concrete walls, Rick transformed. He studied law, filing his own appeals, learning the legal system that had failed him his entire life. He educated other prisoners, teaching them to read, to think critically, to understand the system that had swallowed them. In 2009, after 15 years in federal prison, Rick's legal appeals finally succeeded. His sentence was reduced, not dismissed, but shortened. In 2009, he walked out of prison, no longer the king of anything, just a man in his 40s trying to rebuild a life from ruins. The world outside had changed. The crack epidemic had faded, replaced by new drugs, new problems. The neighborhoods Rick had poisoned were still broken, still poor, still abandoned by everyone except police and politicians looking for votes. Rick didn't hide. He became an advocate, speaking at schools, at community centers, at universities. He told his story, the real story, without glorification or excuse. He warned kids about the trap he'd fallen into, about the system designed to fail them, about the importance of education and legitimate opportunities. Was it redemption? Perhaps. Or perhaps just a man trying to make sense of a life that had spiraled beyond his control, trying to find meaning in the wreckage. Today, Rick Ross is a free man. He gives speeches, does interviews, works with organizations trying to reform drug laws and provide opportunities for people in communities like the one he grew up in. He's older now, grayer, quieter. The fire that drove him to build an empire has been replaced by something else. Understanding, regret, a complicated mixture of pride and shame. He takes some responsibility for what he did, but not all of it. How can one man be responsible for an epidemic created by poverty, enabled by government, and perpetuated by a system that profits from human suffering? The rapper who took his name, William Leonard Roberts II, professionally known as Rick Ross, built a career on the mythology of Freeway Rick. The real Rick sued initially, angry that someone would profit from his pain, but eventually he let it go. What was the point? The name was bigger than either of them now. Rick looks at the neighborhoods where he once ruled and sees the same poverty, the same desperation, the same abandoned children standing on the same corners. The drugs have changed, powder and crack replaced by pills and crystal, but the story is the same. Different products, same disease. He sees young men making the same choices he made, walking the same path he walked, heading toward the same prison cells he occupied. And he tries to warn them, tries to tell them the truth. The game is rigged, the system is designed to eat you alive, and there's no winning, only surviving. Some listen, most don't, because when you're hungry, when you're desperate, when you're 19 years old with no education and no opportunities, those warnings sound like the noise of a world that already gave up on you. Rick's story isn't just about one man. It's about a country that creates monsters and then acts surprised when they appear. In the 1980s, while Rick was building his empire, the Reagan administration was cutting social programs, eliminating job training, defunding schools, and declaring a war on drugs that targeted users and low-level dealers while leaving the infrastructure of trafficking untouched. Banks laundered billions in drug money with slap-on-the-wrist fines. Pharmaceutical companies created and marketed addictive substances legally, while people like Rick were sentenced to life for doing the same thing on street corners. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also structural, designed into the system. The neighborhoods Rick operated in had been systematically destroyed by redlining, white flight, deindustrialization, and political neglect long before crack arrived. Rick didn't create the conditions for an epidemic. Those conditions already existed. He just monetized them. This doesn't excuse his actions. Thousands of people died because of the poison he sold. Thousands more lost their lives to addiction, to violence, to incarceration. Rick's empire was built on suffering, and no amount of explanation can erase that. But it contextualizes it. Rick Ross wasn't some anomaly, some uniquely evil individual. He was the inevitable result of a system designed to fail people who looked like him, lived where he lived, and started with what he started with. If Rick hadn't built that empire, someone else would have. The demand existed, the supply existed, the infrastructure existed. Rick was just the most efficient operator in a market created by forces far more powerful than any street dealer could ever be. Here's what makes Rick's story so disturbing. Almost everyone involved was guilty. The Nicaraguan suppliers who provided the powder were CIA-connected assets, protected because they funded anti-communist rebels. The banks that laundered the money knew exactly what they were doing. They just calculated that the fines would be smaller than the profits. The police who arrested low-level dealers while the wholesale distributors operated freely because street arrests look good in press conferences and get politicians re-elected. The prosecutors who built careers on putting poor black men away for decades while white powder users in corporate offices faced no consequences. The politicians who passed mandatory minimums, destroyed families, and filled prisons with nonviolent offenders, then gave speeches about being tough on crime. The media that glorified gangster culture turned dealers into celebrities and created a mythology around the drug trade that made it attractive to kids who had no other vision of success. And Rick himself, who knew what his product did, saw the damage daily and kept selling anyway because the money was too good and the alternative was invisibility. Everyone played their part, everyone profited. And when it was over, when the damage was done and the communities were destroyed, everyone pointed fingers at everyone else. Rick went to prison. The bankers got bonuses. The CIA agents got promotions, the politicians got reelected, the pharmaceutical executives got richer, and the neighborhoods stayed broken. That's the real story. Not one man's rise and fall, but an entire system's complicity in the destruction of communities deemed expendable. Walk through South Central today, through Compton, through Watts, and you'll see Rick's legacy everywhere. Not in monuments or statues, but in the empty buildings, the memorial murals, the older generation still struggling with addictions planted decades ago. You'll see it in the generation of children who grew up without fathers because those fathers were either dead or in prison. In the mothers who survived the epidemic but carry the scars. In the economic devastation that never recovered because an entire generation was lost to drugs, violence, and incarceration. But you'll also see resilience. Communities that survived Rick's empire survived everything. They're not easily destroyed. There's renewal, rebuilding, resistance, not because of government programs or outside help, but because people refuse to give up on their neighborhoods even when everyone else has. Rick's name endures, borrowed by a rapper, whispered in documentaries, studied in college courses about the crack epidemic. But the man himself? He's just a cautionary tale now, a chapter in a larger story about race, poverty, drugs, and the American tendency to create problems and then criminalize the people most affected by them. Some see Rick as a villain, the man who poisoned a generation. Others see him as a victim, a poor kid trapped in a system designed to destroy him. The truth, as always, is more complicated. He was both, villain and victim, monster and pawn, brilliant and foolish. He made choices, terrible choices, that hurt countless people. But he made those choices in a context created by forces far more powerful and far more culpable than one illiterate teenager from South Central. Rick is in his 60s now. He lives quietly, speaks at events, works on projects aimed at helping people avoid the path he took. He's not rich. The government seized everything years ago. He's not famous. He's more myth than man at this point. He carries the weight of his past like chains he can never fully remove. Every speech he gives, every interview he does, he has to confront what he did, what he was, what he became. Does he regret it? Yes. Would he do it differently? He says yes. Do we believe him? Does it matter? The empire he built is long gone, dismantled by law enforcement and time, but the template remains. The crack trade may have faded, but the drug trade didn't. It evolved. Crystal replaced crack. Pills replaced powder. But the fundamental equation remained the same. Desperate people selling poison to other desperate people while everyone with power profits, and no one with power faces consequences. Rick watches young men walking the same path he walked and sees himself, not with pride, but with a sick recognition. The system hasn't changed. The opportunities haven't improved. The desperation hasn't faded. If anything, it's worse. At least in the 1980s, there was manufacturing, there were options, there was a dream, even if it was a lie. Now there's nothing. Just debt, low-wage service jobs, and the streets. Always the streets, waiting, ready to swallow another generation. Rick tried to beat the system. He thought if he got rich enough, he could escape. But the system isn't something you escape. It's something that uses you until you're no longer useful, then discards you. He's a living reminder of that truth. A ghost walking through a world that's moved on, carrying memories of an empire built on ashes and blood. This is the question that haunts every discussion of Rick Ross. Was he evil? A monster? Or just a product of his environment? The answer is uncomfortable. He was human. He wasn't a sadist. He didn't torture people for pleasure. He didn't set out to destroy communities. He was a kid from South Central who wanted to escape poverty, who found an opportunity, and who pursued it with the same ruthless efficiency that corporate executives use to maximize shareholder value. The difference? Corporate executives destroy lives legally. Rick destroyed lives illegally. But the destruction is the same. He sold poison. But so do tobacco companies. He profited from addiction. But so do pharmaceutical companies. He targeted vulnerable communities. But so does every predatory lender, every lottery system, every casino. The moral distinction between Rick and legitimate business people isn't as clear as society pretends. The only real difference is legality. And legality is often just a question of who has the power to write the laws. This doesn't excuse Rick. It contextualizes him. He caused immense suffering. He has to live with that. But he didn't create the suffering. It was already there. He just monetized it more efficiently than most. The real evil wasn't Rick Ross. The real evil was the system that created the conditions where Rick Ross was inevitable. The poverty, the racism, the abandonment, the lack of opportunities, the government complicity, that's the evil. Rick was just the face it wore for a decade. In the end, Freeway Rick Ross wasn't the disease. He was the fever, the body's desperate reaction to a poison already in the blood. Some people broke the law. Rick broke the world. But the world was already broken. He just made money from the pieces. They called him a king. But kings are born into power. Rick clawed his way up from nothing, built an empire from dust and desperation, and fed an entire nation's addiction. Not because he was evil, but because he was exactly what America creates when it abandons its children. A survivor willing to do anything to stop being invisible. The courts gave him life. Education gave him freedom. And now, he walks the streets of South Central as a living warning. The American dream is a lie, but the American nightmare? That's real. And it's always hiring. Some men build empires that last forever. Rick built one that burned bright and fast, consuming everything in its path before collapsing into ash. But the ash is still there, still choking the same neighborhoods, still burying the same dreams. Freeway Rick Ross couldn't read, so he learned the only language that mattered in South Central: money, power, and survival. And for one terrible, brilliant decade, he spoke that language better than anyone in American history. The king is gone, the empire is dust, but the system that built him, that's still running, still churning out monsters, still feeding on the poor and desperate. Because Freeway Rick Ross didn't break the system, he was the system. And someone, somewhere, is already learning the lessons he taught.